He called me dead weight in front of 43 people. I know it was 43 because I counted them afterward, standing in the parking lot, trying to remember how to breathe. That was a Tuesday. By Friday, the restaurant had lost 3 of its biggest catering contracts. The weekend reservation system had crashed completely, and my former boss, the man who just bought into the family business and decided he was going to modernize everything, was calling my cell phone every 40 minutes. I didn't pick up. Let me back up. I'd been with Hargroves for 19 years. If you're from the Charlotte area, you know the name. White tablecloth place on Providence Road, the kind that's been around long enough that people book it for anniversaries, retirement dinners, the rehearsal dinner before the rehearsal dinner. My father-in-law, Gene, opened it in 1987 with his wife Loretta and a loan from her parents that took them 11 years to pay back. I married their daughter, Cassie, in 2003, and by 2005 I was working the floor. Not because Gene handed me anything. He was very clear about that from day one. I started as a server. I learned the bar. I learned the kitchen. I learned the vendor relationships, the health code compliance cycles, the city permits, the way the walk-in cooler ran 3 degrees warm in summer, and you had to account for that when you were aging beef. By 2018, I was essentially running the operational side of the business, while Gene handled the dining room relationships and Loretta managed the books. It wasn't a title I ever had officially. Gene didn't believe in titles much. He used to say, "The people who need a nameplate to feel important are the ones you have to watch." That's written on a 247 on a Tuesday afternoon. Gene had a mild stroke in early 2022. Nothing catastrophic. He recovered well. Speech came back fully. He was back in the restaurant within 4 months. But it scared him. It scared him. It scared him. And I think it made him feel like he needed to do something about succession before he lost the chance to choose. His son, my brother-in-law Nate, had never had much interest in the business. Nate was a good guy, just not a restaurant guy. He lived in Austin, worked in tech, called on holidays. Cassie had always been more present, but she built her own career in nursing and genuinely loved it. Neither of them wanted to step in. So Gene started talking to outside investors. I wasn't against that idea. We'd had a few lean years. COVID had nearly ended us, like it had nearly ended everyone in hospitality. And I understood that bringing in capital and fresh eyes wasn't the worst thing. I'd been the one pulling 16-hour days that keep us compliant when the PPP rules kept changing. I knew the business needed something. What I didn't expect was Derek. Derek came into a mutual acquaintance of Gene's from the Chamber of Commerce. He'd sold a mid-sized logistics company in 2019 and was looking, as he put it, to get into experiential hospitality. He was 41, wore good watches, talked a lot about brand elevation and experience architecture. In our first meeting, he referred to the dining room as the customer-facing revenue zone. I wrote it off as consultant speak. I was wrong to do that. Gene liked him. Gene liked that he had capital and that he came in with what looked like genuine enthusiasm. The deal they structured gave Derek a 40% stake in exchange for an infusion that would cover a full kitchen renovation and a technology overhaul. Gene retained majority ownership, but gave Derek operational control authority, the right to make staffing and process decisions without requiring Gene's approval on each one. I remember reading that clause in the agreement and feeling something in my chest go cold. I mentioned it to Cassie. She said I was overthinking it, that Gene would keep things reasonable. Derek started in September of 2023. The first 2 months were fine. He spent a lot of time observing, asking questions, taking notes on his iPad. Some of his ideas were actually good. He streamlined our online reservation flow, negotiated a better deal with one of our linen suppliers, suggested a brunch service on Sundays that turned out to be genuinely popular. I was starting to think I'd misread him. Then January came. He sat me down in the small office off the kitchen, the one that still had Gene's old Cubs schedule on the wall, and told me he'd been reviewing operational costs. He said the business was carrying redundancy in institutional knowledge, and that what Hargroves needed going forward was systematized processes not person-dependent tribal knowledge. I said, "Can you say that in English?" He said he was planning to bring in a new operations management system and a hospitality tech consultant to document and digitize every process in the restaurant, and that he was looking at whether my role in its current form was right-sized for where we're taking this. I told him that I'd be glad to work with any documentation process. I told him there were things in this operation that took me years to learn and that I was happy to help transfer that knowledge in a structured way. I said it plainly and without ego because I genuinely meant it. I wasn't trying to protect my turf. I just knew how much was in my head that wasn't written down anywhere. He nodded, said he appreciated my collaborative spirit. 3 weeks later, he brought in a guy named Miles, mid-30s, had worked at a hotel group in Atlanta and a chain restaurant consulting firm. Nice enough. Didn't know the first thing about independent fine dining. Didn't know our suppliers by name. I'd never had to negotiate with a city inspector at 7 a.m. on a Saturday before a private event. I spent 6 weeks working alongside Miles, teaching him everything I could. I documented processes I'd never documented. I wrote SOPs for things I'd been doing by instinct for a decade. I gave him every vendor contact, every equipment maintenance schedule, every quirk of the building. I told him the walk-in ran warm. I told him which health inspector came in most strictly in the spring. I told him that our biggest catering client, a law firm on Tryon Street, always needed the event confirmed 3 times, and that the contact person there would panic call if she didn't hear from us by Wednesday for a Friday event. I did all of that because I thought it was the right thing to do. Because this was Gene's restaurant. Because Cassie had grown up in this place. Because I still believed, somehow, that Derek would see the value in a proper, complete transition. He didn't. On a Wednesday afternoon in late March, Derek called a full staff meeting. Front of house, back of house, everyone. I walked in thinking it was about the spring menu rollout we'd been planning. Gene wasn't there. He'd had a follow-up cardiology appointment that day. Loretto wasn't there either. Derek stood at the front of the room, and without any preamble, without any private conversation beforehand, he looked at me in front of the entire staff and said, "As of today, we're moving forward without you. We're restructuring operations, and your position is being eliminated. I want to thank you for your years of service." Years of service. 19 years. To a restaurant I had helped save during a pandemic. In front of people I'd hired, trained, and worked beside for years. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I reached into my pocket, and I set my keys on the table. The master set. The ones that opened the building. The walk-in. The office. The liquor storage. The exterior alarm panel. I'd carried those keys for 11 years. I set them down quietly. I said, "Okay." I nodded to the staff, most of whom looked like they were trying not to make eye contact with anyone, and I walked out. I got to my car. I sat there for about 15 minutes. Then I drove home. Cassie was working a shift. I texted her. She called me back in under 2 minutes, and I could hear the nurse's station behind her. I told her what happened. There was a silence on the line that felt very long. "He didn't tell Dad," she said. It wasn't a question. "Gene wasn't there," I said. Another silence. Then, "I'll call you when I'm off." Now here's the part I need to explain, because I've seen the comments on these kinds of stories, and I already know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, why didn't you refuse to leave? Why didn't you call Gene right then? Why didn't you warn them about everything that was about to fall apart? The honest answer is complicated. Part of it was pride. Not the ugly kind, the kind that says, if he wants me gone that badly, in front of everyone, without a single private conversation, without even the courtesy of telling my father-in-law first, then he can have exactly what he's asked for. He wanted the building without the foundation. Fine, he could have it. But part of it was also something more calculated. Because I knew, and I want to be precise about this, I knew that Miles was not ready. Not even close. I had done everything I could to prepare him. I had given him everything I had. But there is no documentation that replaces 19 years of specific, relational, time-tested operational knowledge. There is no SOP for the phone call you get at 11 p.m. from a vendor who is short on product for your Saturday service and who will prioritize you over other clients only because you have a 15-year relationship with him. There is no checklist that tells you the specific way the city fire marshal interprets the occupancy rules for our private dining room. I had tried to write it all down. I had given Miles the map. But knowing the map and knowing the terrain are not the same thing. I did not sabotage anything. I want to be very clear about that. I didn't delete files. I didn't call vendors and tell them not to work with the restaurant. I didn't take anything with me that wasn't mine. I took nothing except myself and the institutional memory that had never been fully transferred because you cannot fully transfer 19 years in 6 weeks. The first sign came Thursday morning, 2 days after I left. Our produce vendor, a family operation out of Huntersville we'd worked with for over a decade, had a standing delivery protocol that existed entirely in the form of a personal relationship between me and the owner's son. The purchase order system in the restaurant's software showed a generic weekly order. What the software didn't know was that I had a separate understanding with Danny about premium seasonal items that came in limited quantities. I would call him Monday morning and tell him what we needed for the upcoming week based on what Chef was planning. It was informal. It was human. It was how independent restaurant supply has always worked. Miles didn't know to call Danny on Monday. He relied on the system order. Danny, not knowing otherwise, filled the system order and allocated the premium seasonal stock, some heritage pork and early spring ramps that our chef had planned the new menu around, to other clients. Thursday evening, Chef texted me. He wasn't asking me to come back. He was just venting, the way we'd vented to each other for years. I listened. I didn't say much. Friday is when the catering contracts fell apart. The law firm on Tryon, the one I'd specifically warned Miles about, had a firm-wide anniversary dinner booked for Saturday evening. It was a $14,000 event. Their contact, a woman I'd worked with for 6 years, had called Wednesday to confirm. Miles had taken the call but hadn't followed up with a written confirmation, which was our standard protocol for events over $10,000. She'd panicked by Friday afternoon, called the restaurant, reached a host who didn't know the full story, and by 5 p.m. she had canceled and rebooked with a competitor. $14,000. Gone. For want of a follow-up email. There were 2 other smaller catering miscommunications that same week. A birthday dinner for 25 that had the wrong date in the new system, and a corporate lunch where the dietary restriction notes hadn't transferred correctly from the old reservation platform to the new one. Derek, to his credit, did not immediately call me. He held out for almost 4 days, but by Sunday night, I had 6 missed calls from his number. I called Gene first. I want to be clear about that too. I did not let Gene find out through Derek, or through Cassie, or through rumor. I called him myself. He had found out about the firing the same day. Loretta had heard from one of the servers, and he was, in his quiet way, furious. Not at me. He was furious at Derek in the specific, controlled way that men of his generation express real anger, which is to say, he became very precise and very still when he talked about it. He asked me if I wanted to come back. I told him the truth. I said I didn't know yet. I said I needed a few days to think about what I actually wanted, separate from anger and separate from loyalty. He said he understood. He said he understood. He said, whatever you decide, I want you to know that what he did was wrong, and I should have had a structure that prevented it. That sentence hit me harder than almost anything, because Gene was taking partial responsibility for the situation, not for Derek's behavior, but for creating a governance structure that allowed it. He was right, and hearing him say it out loud did something to the anger I was carrying. It didn't dissolve it, but it changed shape. Meanwhile, Derek was still calling. I finally picked up on Monday morning, 8 days after the firing. I let him talk first. He went through the catering losses, the vendor issues, the staff morale problems. He said that Miles was still getting up to speed and that there had been a steeper learning curve than anticipated. He said he thought it would be beneficial for everyone if I could come back in a consulting capacity to help with the transition. I said, "You fired me in front of my entire staff. You didn't tell my father-in-law first. You called me dead weight." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That was a poor choice of words. I acknowledge that. Poor choice of words." I told him I would think about it. I got off the phone. I sat in my kitchen and I thought about what I actually wanted. What I did not want was to go back to working for Derek. That was clear. What I did want was for Jean's restaurant, Loretta's restaurant, the place where Cassie had done homework at table 6 as a kid, where her parents had built a life to survive. Those two things were not necessarily in conflict. I called the labor attorney that same week. I want to mention that because the number one question I've gotten on this kind of story is why the person didn't pursue legal action. The honest answer is, I did look into it. In North Carolina, employment is at will, which means that outside of specific protected characteristics, an employer can terminate you without cause. I was technically an employee of the restaurant, not just a family member. There was a potential claim around the manner of the termination, the public nature of it, the potential for a hostile work environment argument. But my attorney told me that while I had some grounds to be upset, the financial damages would be difficult to quantify in a way that made litigation worth pursuing. What she did tell me is that I had significant leverage in a negotiation if I chose to use it. I chose to use it. I did not go back as a consultant. I went back as a part owner. The conversation took about 3 weeks and a mediator and one very long Sunday afternoon at Jean and Loretta's kitchen table. Derek's position had weakened considerably. The restaurant had lost over $40,000 in catering revenue in the first 2 weeks after my departure. Staff turnover had begun, and 2 reviews on Yelp and Google had specifically mentioned a drop in the personal touch that longtime customers associated with Hargroves. Derek came to the table ready to offer a consulting retainer. He left having agreed to a restructured ownership arrangement that gave me a 15% equity stake and a formalized operational director role with defined protections, meaning he could not eliminate the position without board-level approval, which now required Jean's consent. Miles, for what it's worth, left the restaurant 4 months later, not because anyone pushed him out. I actually tried to work well with him during the transition period, and I meant it. He just figured out that independent fine dining wasn't his thing. He went back to hotel operations in Atlanta. I hope he's doing well. I want to say something about the lesson here, because I've thought about it a lot, and I don't want to be glib about it. The lesson is not never share your knowledge, or be a single point of failure on purpose so you can't be replaced. That's a terrible lesson, and it's also bad for everyone around you, including the people and places you care about. If I had documented those vendor relationships better from the beginning, not as leverage, just as good operational practice, some of what happened could have been avoided. The catering confirmation failure wasn't Rick's fault. It was a process gap. I carry some of that. Gene acknowledged his role. Responsibility, when you look at it honestly, is almost never one person's alone. But the other part of the lesson, the part I keep coming back to, is this. There is no software system, no consultant, no operational overhaul that replaces what a person learns from 19 years of showing up and caring. That knowledge lives somewhere specific. When you fire it out the door, you don't eliminate it. You just lose access to it. Derek wanted disruption. He got it, just not the kind he was planning. Jean and Loretta came into the restaurant the first Saturday after I was back, and Jean walked the dining room the way he always had, stopping at tables, knowing names, shaking hands. At one point, he stopped at the table in the corner by the window. The one we'd always called the anniversary table because more couples had gotten engaged there than anywhere else in the restaurant. He stood there for a moment, just looking at the room. Then he looked at me across the floor and gave me the small nod that I had learned over 19 years meant something like, "This is still what it's supposed to be." I nodded back. That was enough. I still think about those keys, the weight of them in my pocket for 11 years, and then the specific silence of setting them down on that table and walking away. There's something I've learned about cause and effect that no business school teaches cleanly. The consequences of how you treat people don't arrive on your schedule. Derek thought the moment he said, "You're eliminated," was the end of the story. It wasn't. It was the beginning of a different one he hadn't planned for and couldn't control. What happened to Hargroves in those 2 weeks wasn't sabotage. It was just reality, catching up. Every relationship I'd built with Danny over a decade of Monday morning calls, every protocol I'd developed for the Tryon Street law firm, every unwritten understanding that kept the kitchen running when the system said one thing and the actual supply chain said another. None of that disappeared because Derek signed a piece of paper. It just became inaccessible to him. He'd fired the door and kept the lock. I think about the integrity piece a lot, not in the self-congratulatory way. I mean the very simple question of, what do you do when no one is watching and you have every reason to burn something down? I had that moment. I sat in my car in that parking lot and I could feel the anger like something physical, sitting in my chest. I could have called Danny and told him not to prioritize Hargrove's orders. I could have reached out to the law firm contact and let something slip. I didn't, not because I'm a saint, because I knew clearly that Gene's restaurant was not the same thing as Derek's decision. Those were separable, and I chose to treat them as separable. That's distinction. Holding your integrity even when the situation gives you cover not to. That's the thing I'm most settled about when I look back. The judgment part is harder to talk about because it requires admitting what I got wrong. I hadn't documented those vendor relationships from the beginning. Not as leverage, just as good practice. I'd let the institutional knowledge live entirely in my head because that's how it had always worked, and changing the system felt like overhead I didn't have time for. That was a failure of clear thinking on my part. Gene acknowledged his governance failure. I've had to acknowledge mine. Good judgment means being honest about your own blind spots, not just the other person's. And then there's the staying power, the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The 19 years. The pandemic year when I was on the phone with PPP lenders at midnight. The Saturday morning with the fire marshal. The slow accumulation of showing up every day, even when Gene wasn't watching and Derek wouldn't have cared. That's not glamorous. It doesn't make a good highlight reel. But it is the thing that made everything else possible. The equity stake I walked away with. The restored relationships. The fact that Gene gave me that nod across the dining room. None of that existed without the years nobody saw. Derek wanted to skip the foundation and get straight to the building. That's not how anything real gets built. I know that now more clearly than I ever have. And I knew it, in some quiet way, the moment I set those keys on the table and walked out with my head up.